Good afternoon. This is Harold Waters and then Greg Labarge also to assist me today to talk about the update that we had to the Tri-State Fertilizer Recommendations just recently published. So this is Tri-State Fertilizer Recommendations for corn, soybean, wheat, and alfalfa. And Ohio State led the effort. Certainly Steve Coleman worked very hard on this, but Purdue University and Michigan State University also were involved. So we have a lot of data we can take a look at to kind of pull together these recommendations. So the 1995 Tri-State Fertilizer Recommendations, 25 years ago, really brought about a new way to think about recommendations in Ohio. About 40 years worth of work went into that publication, I would guess. But it really served as a cornerstone of how to manage fertilizer applications for corn, soybean, wheat, and alfalfa. On the other hand, today, folks think that's been a long time. Things have changed. They want to know, are crops today yielding better than they did then? And of course, we know they are, but do they need more nutrients? And then environmental concerns have come in. So the 2020 Tri-State Fertilizer Recommendations for corn, soybean, wheat, and alfalfa was updated, published. And I think of this as an update because it's not a dramatic departure from the 1995 publication. It was updated and released in November of 2020, just this past fall. And then again, it unifies the NP&K recommendations again across this region, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan. It was a large effort for a whole lot of people who were involved, including industry, commodity groups, environmental groups as well, all had some, I guess, reason to have some input with this. And we appreciate effort. So again, it's Bulletin 974. I'll say that again later. But if you're looking for this, I do encourage you to get the publication. It's free online. So the Tri-State Fertilizer Recommendations, Bulletin 974, and you can find it online. Google, probably as easy as anything.
And
So
Harold,
yes.
as you talk about that, I think all the purposes that you identified are great and are part of what we're thinking about. But really, what we're really trying to accomplish with the Tri-State Fertilizer Guide is know what the yield response is to fertilizer additions, and then put that into, I think, in the future, some kind of economic understanding, because certainly margins have tightened. We see a lot more land leased. So the ideal of applying fertilizer because of maintaining soil test levels is one portion of that, but then also seeing an economic response that pays for that fertilizer in a short period of time, especially where we're under leased land conditions. So just something that is kind of built into this that I think people need to understand.
Right. It's an economic model. We talked about that with our corn nitrogen rate calculators being an economic model, but it's the case with P&K as well. I really like the way that Steve Coleman kind of rolls it out, and we'll get to a slide here in a couple minutes, saying that it is economical to apply fertilizer here, and it's not economical to apply fertilizer there. Yeah, it's an economic model. I also like the fact that Steve says we get to a point where there is no reason to apply fertilizer at all, P or K. And again, it's a good strategy as far as I'm concerned. It certainly draws concern to those economics, but I think it also draws to those concerns about environmental awareness as well. So anyway, lots of work, certainly since Steve Coleman came on in 2014, so a 5-year period, plus he's continued to do the work. But look at corn, soybean, wheat response to NP&K additions. And then as I said, lots of assistance from many people, commodity groups, certainly funding, USDA, and then work with industry agronomists, crop consultants, lots of extension people across the state as well. Map here on the right shows in 2017 what counties involved, but I think over the 5 or so years, at least 39 counties across the state of Ohio were involved in this work. A big change from the 3 counties that would have been involved in 1995. Update from Ohio. Of course, we had Purdue and Michigan State work as well. All these samples pulled were 8-inch depth. That is how we calibrated, I guess, if you will, the soil tests, and then the crop benefit, whatever, as well, was based on that 8-inch depth soil nutrient analysis. Did a little bit of sulfur work, of course, continued nitrogen work as well. And again, I don't want to forget, but Purdue and Michigan State University also contributed the recent research they did as well to this document. So it's pretty thorough. not just for Ohio, but also across the region. Here is my brief slide. For those of you who like to catch it early and then take a nap, this is the part you need to pay attention. And then you can pay a little bit less attention as I fill in some of the details. So the big news as far as the 2020 update is that the extractant today, we're going to be using the Malic 3. That is what the labs across the state, across the region have been using for a number of years. But it took the work to calibrate yield response to nutrient addition under those or with that extractant before we really know if we could say this is what we need to understand for Malic 3. So we've done that. At the same time, Steve also did the Brave P1 for phosphorus and made correlations between that and Malic 3 and did the same thing for ammonium acetate to Malic 3 for potassium. So we have updated somewhat the critical level and maintenance range because we're using Malic. There are some slight numeric differences. We understand those and we just put them in that perspective. So no dramatic change there actually from the 1995 publication. One thing is a slightly philosophical difference, maybe I'll say in this regard, but the CEC has been reduced in our concerns about it. It looks like we have a break point on some of the very low CEC soils, but once we get above about 6, the response is very similar. So we don't really use that CEC breakdown anymore. Greg, I know you had some concerns about some of those heavy clays, but we see the response today, at least, being very similar to the silt loams. I know we probably have some special spots within the state where we have to maybe modify things a little bit, particularly on the sands, but I think on the heavy clays, maybe the stuff we have difficulty farming, it looks like it does hold on to potassium pretty well. But I think the farmers already know that, and we don't really need to make recommendations for them. Again, we can't make recommendations for every soil in the state. We have some general recommendations, and these are good general guidelines, maybe the best way to think about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, when we think about potassium management, something else that was done with these recommendations is actually we expanded out. We kind of, at least for those soils that you're mentioning, Harold, lowered the critical level and also raised the upper end of the maintenance range over what would have been in 1995 for a similar soil type. So I think that gives us more flexibility to manage potassium and once again, think about it in that vein of economic applications and what we're going to see a return on over a shorter period of time.
Crop removal rates changed as well. Crops today, corn, soybean, wheat at least, are more efficient at making grain with less nutrients on a per unit basis. On a per acre basis, it's probably higher because yields have gone up, of course. And then there is some philosophical change, and this really follows, if you read the 1995 publication, it's really in there as well. P2O recommendations is basically crop removal across the soil test levels. K2O recommendation is crop removal plus 20. I know that was a controversial remark or recommendation in the 1995 publication, but we're keeping it. It looks like there is some need for a little bit of additional potassium, and that recommendation stays for Ohio and Indiana for the 2020 publication. And then buildup is optional now. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Lime recommendations really haven't changed. They've been around for quite a while now. I think 1997 is when those were updated, so no real changes there. One thing I guess on pH and lime recommendations is that as we've talked about phosphorus over the last 5-7 years now and concerns about that with Lake Erie, but also other areas in the state, we've kind of forgotten that we need to watch our K levels and our pH, but try and bring some concern back to that. And then nitrogen recommendations were updated in 2018, March of 2018. Those recommendations are included in this publication as well. And then some slight changes for wheat recommendations, but those are based on yield goal, whereas the corn nitrogen recommendations are based on economics. So this is the philosophy, slightly different in that we stop at the maintenance limit, and this is just a generic fertilizer application chart, whatever would apply for both P and K. As I said, the buildup is now optional. And in maintenance, what we call the crop removal, and then it would be crop removal plus 20 for the K2O. But we would basically make an application that as a crop removes nutrients, we would replace them. And then for less than a critical level where we have phosphorus or P and K rates, I should let P and K nutrient levels less than the critical level, we would probably recommend an annual application. And then if we're in the critical level up to the maintenance limits, so that maintenance range, you could make the application of fertilizer anytime in that rotation. And again, here Greg gets into that economics. This is some emphasis that Steve has put in. If you have low soil test levels, the yield response to fertilizer is going to be more likely. And we've tried to put some percents on that. So it's kind of hard to do as you go across state, because there's some areas where even very low levels, we still get no response to applied fertilizer. But in general, we get our greatest yield response to added fertilizer in those deficit areas, those low testing areas. If we're in that maintenance range, response to fertilizer is not expected. We're simply applying maintenance levels. And then if we get to that maintenance level, what we used to call the drawdown phase, no agronomic reason, no economic reason to apply fertilizer up there.
So basically, below that critical level, what we have is we have the greatest potential for response. So applying fertilizer in that year, and maybe even thinking about placement in a 2x2 placement or banded placement, probably it helps us out as far as seeing response to fertilizer and assuring we have productivity, even though it may be a situation where we're leasing the land and we don't necessarily want to build up soil test levels.
Right. And that's what we saw in the trial work. And I think it was about 100 tests across the state for phosphorus and about 100 more for potassium. And what we saw was that if you make that annual application as low testing soils, really no reduction in yield from what you might have above that critical level. So annual application certainly can help in those low testing areas. And yes, if it's rented ground, the likelihood is maybe that's where you have the low testing soils. You just don't want to spend the money to build them up. So extractant, as I said, Malik 3 is going to be the new accepted soil test for future. I have some in gray there in the middle of the screen. If you have some old records with Bray P1, from Steve's work, we've determined that you could multiply the M3, the Malik 3 times 0.75, you get the Bray P1, or take the Bray P1 and time 1.35. That would give you the Malik 3. So you go back and forth with those tests. For potassium, it's close to the ammonium acetate test we've used in the past. I think it's about, 10% or so off, Greg, if I remember correctly. Yeah, so if you want to make an exact calculation, that those numbers are in the new publication, you can make that. But generally speaking, it's close enough to the ammonium acetate test. We can just use those numbers. And then the labs around the state are now using the Sikora modified SMP for lime recommendations. But again, buffer pH is used to make that lime recommendation. There's just been some lab safety interest in moving to a Sikora versus the SMP, and similar results are offered, so we can trust that as well. Again, that's a move that the labs have already made.
Yeah, and just hit that again, that the buffer pH is used only for making the lime recommendation. We're using the water pH that still is on the soil test to help us understand availability of nutrients. And I think a chart that you're going to show later.
Yep. So here's some quick comparison just between the 2020 tri-state nutrient removal versus the 1995 tri-state nutrient removal. In general, as I said earlier, crops are more efficient today at making grain with less nutrients on a per unit basis. You can see the percents there run from flat for the P2O5 on soybean, but 5 to 32% for K2O on wheat. To me, that's a pretty dramatic difference. I could kind of understand why that might have happened for corn and soybean because of the intensive breeding that we do in those two crops. Wheat a little less so, but it still shows up within those new wheat varieties. So there have been some changes. And then here's the basis for our fertilizer recommendations. Again, we use it on a nutrient removal basis. So corn, soybean, wheat for phosphorus. Actually, I'll start first. 0.35 P2O5 removal for corn, 0.8 removal for soybean, 0.5 for wheat. So those would be multiply your bushels, 200 bushels times for corn, times 0.35 would give you a 70-pound recommendation for maintenance. Same way with K2O, 0.2, 1.15, 0.25 for wheat. So again, a 200 bushel corn crop times 0.2 would give you a 40-pound recommendation. Add 20 for that potassium, and so it would actually be a 60-pound K2O recommendation for corn. And again, those would be the basis for our recommendations.
And Harold, are we the only state that's been looking at these crop removal rates and made changes to those crop removal rates?
So no, I've talked to I've had friends, whatever, working in some other states, and they're doing the same thing. They've also seen this change in efficiency of crops. I know I've got a friend in Kansas, they're looking at potassium. They have high natural potassium levels in their soils. They have higher crop removal than this, but it's because the crops will take up luxuriant levels of potassium. So they don't necessarily recommend crop removal in those states. What they do is they recommend something about what crop need would be. So their recommendation would be a little bit different than ours, but again, it's because they have higher subsoil levels and higher background material, higher potassium levels in those soils. Forages, we took some information from the International Plant Nutrition Institute, published 2014, and we're using those in our recommendations for corn, silage, and alfalfa for crop removal. I should point out, and it was in the original 1995 publication and not as well pointed out in the 2020 publication, but it's there, is that these are the recommendations, but the other primary recommendation is that every 3 to 4 years, so every rotation to 2 rotations, you pull soil tests and you check your rates. So if we're off a little bit on these, we catch those up in a 3 or 4 year time period, see if our soil test levels are moving up and down depending on our maintenance applications, and we can make some changes. And that's what should be done on an on-farm basis across the state. Keep those old records intact and look back on them before you make any dramatic changes. And then here's our maintenance ranges and critical level. I put in red here the critical levels. So for phosphorus, for corn and soybeans, is 20. That would equate to a 15 on a Bray P1. And again, numerically different, but it's the same number as far as actual soil is concerned. It's just using a different test and make 3. So 20 parts per million. For wheat and alfalfa, need a little more phosphorus for them on a soil test level basis. So 30 parts per million. For potassium, I'd put loam and clay soils first. I think our chart in the book actually reverses these, but I tend to think about the soils we have, 90% or so of soils across the state are in those loam and clay soils. So let's think about that first. The 120 would be our critical level for potassium. And as Greg pointed out earlier, we have a range, whatever maintenance range. So 20 to 40 for corn and soybeans on phosphorus, 30 to 50 on alfalfa for phosphorus. For potassium, it's the same for all those 4 crops, 120 to 170. And then if you get into have some sandy soils on the farm, and I know I work with some folks who have some spots like this, it will not hold potassium as well as the clays and the loams. And so we just simply don't recommend you push to higher levels. So 90 to 130 would work on those lower CEC soils.
So while we're looking at this once again, I'm thinking about my soil test results. What does it mean if I'm below the critical level with my soil test results?
So that's the point. If you're below the critical level, that's the point at which you're likely to get an economic benefit, an agronomic benefit to applying fertilizer. If you're in the maintenance range, again, that's the numbers between the 2040, the 120, 170. You don't need to apply fertilizer every year. You just put it on sometime during the rotation. If you want to put on every year, that's fine. But it's just important that you get it on during that rotation, not necessarily that you put it on every year. Is that kind of what you're thinking about, Greg?
Yeah, that was exactly what I wanted you to say while I'm thinking about my soil test results and looking at this chart.
Great. And then back to the buildup optional, just a moment. I mean, if you own your own land, we're going to suggest that you probably do some buildup. Long term, we think you're better off being in that maintenance range rather than below it, that critical level. And so, the way you build up, and there's a formula in the book for P and K, both by crop, so you can go in there and take a look at the publication. But and you can find that at extensionpubs.osu.edu, or again, just Google it. Um, but you want to apply, if you're below that critical level, you probably want to apply additional fertilizer. And a way you build your soil test levels is to put on more than crop removal. And in the past, that would have been a 4 to 5 year plan. I know some farmers now, they're more thinking like an 8 year plan or a 7 year plan. That's fine. Go through two rotations of your soil testing and maybe build it up over an 8 year time period. That's fine, but it's going to take a little bit extra fertilizer to get that soil test to move back up. And the lower it is, the more it's going to take. So it's not a straight line like we kind of show here. It's more like a curve. So the lower your soil test levels, the more it'll take to build you up.
And I think at that point, it's probably good to mention soil testing is such a critical part of what we can do, and it's so cost effective in relationship to a $400 to $700, $800 an acre cost of putting soybeans and corn in place. That really making that investment, tracking that over time, what we're seeing as far as changes in soil test level, whether we're going up and trying to build, or whether we're coming down where we have excessive phosphorus or potassium in the soil test results, and seeing that come down to that agronomic range really is a great investment for us.
Right. And again, it's one that we can show will pay back. Again, pH, and we recommend this based on what your subsoil pH is. But generally speaking, our crops like to be in above 6. And if you have a lower pH subsoil, you probably want to build it up a little bit beyond that, because some of those roots are going to be down in that subsoil. So generally, Eastern Ohio, we want to build a little bit higher. For Western Ohio, because we have that lime subsoil, probably not as necessary. And just a reminder here, the reason why we kind of push for these pH ranges to be in that 6 to 7 range, maybe 6.5 to 7 range, is because availability of our nutrients. Phosphorus is an easy one to point out here in this little chart, but also our micronutrients is another good reason why we want to keep our pH in those ranges between 6 and 7. I won't spend too much time on this, but these charts are available. Again, it seems like we've kind of forgotten about pH and lime adjustments since we've been worried about the phosphorus levels in Lake Erie, but it is an important consideration, and it is one, again, economically. Greg mentioned earlier about the economics of soil testing. Many farmers I talk to tell me that the reason they can afford to soil test on a regular basis, even on grid basis, is because of the changes they make to pH and with those lime additions to improve their crop production.
And I think one thing that I see on soil test reports quite frequently is soil test or pHs that are in that above 7 range, and we probably need to closely monitor that and try, you know, reduce the applications of lime so that we're in that right range. Particularly if we're just in corn soybean production. If we got alfalfa in the rotation, being closer right around 7 is a good thing, but those other crops we have a lot more flexibility.
Right. And then, as I said, not just manganese, but the micronutrients in general. That's where we start hurting ourselves when we push above those above 7 into those higher pHs. Just they're not good for us, for our crop, and like I said, particularly for the micronutrients. Then, just briefly on the corn nitrogen rates, those are Ohio-based research. So even though we have recommendations in the Tri-State Fertilizer publication, we have them individual by state, and we've all used our local trials to build those recommendations on nitrogen. Again, that's based at Iowa State University at Corn Nitrogen Rate Calculator, CNRC, and you can find those again online, but they're also in our book, in our publication. I'll show you here in just a second. This is what it looks like online. That's what the output is. And in our recommendation here, I use 37-cent nitrogen. Folks I've been talking to this week is that's gone up dramatically since about 2 weeks ago. Corn price is a little higher as well, so you might want to make some adjustments. Probably around that 180 is probably a good magic number, I call it. And you know, it's somewhere in this circle that I put on this chart. Again, this chart is in our Tri-State Fertilizer recommendations for corn, and this one is specific to Ohio. There would be another one for Indiana or for Michigan.
Back up one second
Mm-hmm.
slide, and just as you look at that red line, actually that red line somewhat represents the nitrogen response curve.
Right.
So we're not throwing yields out the window. Actually, what we're doing is maximizing the returns off on that or based off of that yield curve that we have for nitrogen response, and it changes a little bit based off of that ratio of corn to nitrogen price.
Right. Truly, this probably gets more at that economic concern for nitrogen more so than it does for P and K, where we tend to talk about benefits, by your soil test level. With corn, the benefit is truly economic, and our rate recommendation will drive you toward that most economical rate. It does say, and maybe I should point out now, Greg, that the manual, the new Tri-State Fertilizer Recommendation publication, has a long discussion about managing plus or minus from these rates. If you have additional information, if you have um, NDVI reading, something like that, you can modify these recommendations, and they're going to be based on the season, organic matter, uh, practices, soil types, any number of things. But in general, for across the state of Ohio, these are what works. These are based on the end of the year yield, of course. Um, and so we don't necessarily are not able to modify them during the year, but on a long-term basis, this is what makes corn yield in Ohio. So we feel pretty confident in these recommendations. It's just that there is some local modifications allowed. Allowed. You're always welcome to manage as you please, but to benefit your economics is the goal.
And how does that MRTN respond or look in comparison to some other ways that we go about nitrogen recommendations?
So we, in the old tri-state publication, the 1995 version, we had a yield-based recommendation. Um, so economic model seems to work better with nitrogen than the yield goal model for us, at least here in the Eastern Corn Belt. As you go west, I think into North Dakota, maybe Nebraska, they tend to use a yield goal model. But for the 7 states that are involved with the corn nitrogen rate calculator, we all use this economic model. And it looks like it's probably a benefit to the environment as well as our pocketbooks. Wheat nitrogen rates, there's a slight modification in this for the tri-state recommendations. Had a long conversation with a farmer this past Friday. But in general, it's yield goal based, partly because we're not getting as much mineralization when wheat's growing in the fall, in the earlier spring. That starts to kind of turn on late in the growth of the crop. And so we tend to use yield goal. Again, we don't do that for corn anymore, but it seems to fit pretty well for wheat. There's some really good remarks in our publication that I reread here again this past week, talking about pre-plant nitrates. I know that's not something we usually check with wheat. I've got a couple of crop consultants I've talked to who do some of that, and that allows you to determine whether or not you should be putting on some starter fertilizer, nitrogen in particular, in the fall. And in time here in the spring for that spring application. And for the numbers we have on this chart, these are total nitrogen, so fall plus spring nitrogen. And then it's just a matter of putting on maybe that 25 pounds or so in the fall, following up with another 75 or what have you in the next spring. Again, timing here is between green up and jointing. And the goal is to get it on when the crop needs it, because it very rapidly after this jointing period in the plant growth, it takes up a lot of nitrogen in a very short period of time. So to summarize, we changed to Malic 3 for P and K, and actually for P, K, magnesium, calcium, etc. Critical ranges have changed a little bit. It's a numeric change. We're still basically the same as they have been for the 1995 publication in the 220. It's just going to the Malic numbers rather than the others. Crop removal rates have changed, and this is probably the biggest change to our recommendations. They're now more efficient. So actually on a per unit basis, we recommend less. And then generally speaking, our recommendations are for P205, you apply crop removal with that fertilizer application. For K2O, it's crop removal plus 20 pounds of K2O. Lime recommendations, again, were updated some time ago. We're going to continue those. But again, don't let your pHs get out of whack just because you're worried about phosphorus in Lake Erie. Worried about pH as well. It's probably the base concern that we should probably have for our nutrient management. And in nitrogen, again, it's an economic model for corn. Please follow those guidelines and then make some modifications as you see based on your local evaluation. I'll put it that way. And then again, Ohio wheat recommendations are yield goal based. Greg, any final comments? That ends my remarks.
No, I think we're good. And please reach out to us if you have any questions. We also have some spreadsheets and so forth that can help you make decisions. Some things online that are available, and obviously keep track of the corn newsletter.